When Margaret Turner stepped off that dusty stage into Dry Creek, she didn't know the town would weigh her body before her soul, or that the quietest man in 3 counties would become the loudest voice in her defense. A woman society deemed too fat to love, and a widower who'd buried his heart alongside his wife were about to prove that the strongest foundations aren't built on beauty, but on biscuits, bravery, and the kind of stubborn loyalty that stops stampedes and silences mobs. This is the story of how a kitchen became a kingdom, and how 2 broken people became each other's home. Before we begin, I'd love to know, drop a comment with your city, so I can see how far Maggie and Caleb's story travels across the world. Now, let's step into Dry Creek, where everything is about to change. The stage rattled to a stop in a cloud of prairie dust, and Margaret Turner, Maggie to the few who'd ever bothered with kindness, clutched her carpetbag like a shield. Through the small window, Dry Creek spread out before her in shades of weathered wood and sun-baked earth. A mercantile, a saloon with peeling paint, a livery stable, and a scattering of buildings that looked like they'd been dropped onto the plains by an indifferent god and left to fend for themselves. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down, his voice carrying that particular tone men used when they were trying not to stare but couldn't quite help themselves. Maggie took a breath, tasting dust and distance and the faint promise of rain that never seemed to come. She'd traveled 300 miles from St. Louis with 1 trunk, $42, and a newspaper advertisement folded so many times the creases had worn soft as cloth. Cook wanted. Room and board. Dry Creek, Montana Territory. Inquire at Duffy's Mercantile. She climbed down without waiting for assistance. Learned that lesson years ago when a helpful hand turned into an opportunity for commentary and felt the weight of eyes settle on her like flies on honey. A woman sweeping the boardwalk outside the Mercantile paused mid-stroke. 2 men loading a wagon went still, their hands frozen on a grain sack. Even the horses tied at the hitching post seemed to swivel their heads in her direction. Maggie knew what they saw. A woman who took up space. A woman whose dress required extra fabric, whose face was round instead of delicate, whose arms were thick and strong from a lifetime of kneading dough and hauling cast iron. A woman the world had taught to apologize for existing. "Well, hell," one of the men muttered, not quite quiet enough. "That's a whole lot of woman." His companion snorted. "Bet she can eat her weight in flapjacks." Maggie's face burned, but she kept moving, kept her chin level and her eyes forward. This was nothing new. This was every town, every job, every room she'd ever walked into. The difference was that in St. Louis, she'd had Mrs. Henderson's boarding house kitchen to hide in, with its brick walls and familiar routines. Here, there was nowhere to disappear. The mercantile door stood propped open, revealing shelves stocked with canned goods, coils of rope, and the particular jumble of items that defined frontier commerce. Maggie stepped inside, grateful for the shade and the relative privacy. Behind the counter, a thin man with wire spectacles and careful hands was sorting through a ledger. "Help you, miss?" He glanced up and Maggie watched his expression do the thing it always did. Surprise, quick calculation, a flicker of something that might have been pity or might have been disdain. She'd stopped trying to tell the difference. "I'm here about the cook position," she said, keeping her voice steady. "The advertisement in the St. Louis paper." The man, Duffy she assumed, set down his pencil with the careful precision of someone buying time to think. "That position's been filled, I'm afraid." "Filled?" Maggie's stomach dropped. "The advertisement ran 2 weeks ago. I sent a telegram before I left. Must have crossed wires," Duffy said, but his eyes slid away from hers. "Young woman from Billings took the job 3 days back. Real slender thing, easy on the eyes. Mr. Thornton was mighty pleased." Translation. They'd taken one look at the telegraph operator's description of her and decided sight unseen that Margaret Turner wasn't what they wanted serving meals. "I see." Maggie's voice came out flat, scraped clean of disappointment through years of practice. "Is there a hotel in town? I'll need a room while I figure out my next steps." "No hotel," Duffy said, warming slightly now that she'd accepted defeat. "But I've got a room upstairs I rent out sometimes. Small, but clean. $2 a week, paid in advance." Maggie counted out the coins, feeling each one like a piece of her future being traded for present survival. Duffy handed her a key attached to a wooden tag carved with the number 3, then gestured toward a narrow staircase at the back of the store. Up those stairs, last door on the right. Privy's out back, and there's a pump in the alley. You need anything from the store? I'm open dawn to dusk 6 days a week. Thank you, Maggie said, because politeness was armor, and she'd learned to wear it well. The room was exactly what she'd expected. A narrow bed with a thin mattress, a washstand with a chipped basin, one window that looked out over the alley, and enough floor space to turn around without bumping into furniture. She set her carpet bag on the bed and sank down beside it, letting the weight of disappointment settle into her bones. 300 miles. $40, now 38. And nowhere to go but back to St. Louis and Mrs. Henderson's pitying eyes and the other boarders whispering about poor Maggie, who couldn't even find a husband desperate enough to overlook her size. No, she wouldn't think about that, wouldn't let the familiar spiral of shame pull her under. Instead, she unpacked, hung her 2 spare dresses on the wall pegs, set her hairbrush and the small mirror she'd inherited from her mother on the washstand, lined up her cooking things, the good knife she'd saved 6 months to buy, the wooden spoon worn smooth by her hands, the small tin of precious spices she allowed herself to carry, on the windowsill like talismans against despair. By the time the sun started its descent toward the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of amber and rust, Maggie had a plan. Tomorrow, she'd visit every business in Dry Creek. Someone needed a cook or a cleaning woman or someone to do mending. She had skills, and skills were currency, even if the body housing them wasn't what people wanted to look at. Her stomach rumbled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since the brief stop in Junction City that morning. She counted her remaining money and decided she could afford 1 meal out before she'd need to start stretching her supplies. The saloon was the only place in town serving hot food, according to the hand-lettered sign visible from her window. Maggie straightened her dress, pinned her hair more securely, and headed downstairs with the particular kind of courage it took to walk into a room full of strangers when you knew exactly what they'd think of you. The Crystal Creek Saloon smelled like tobacco, spilled whiskey, and frying meat. Maggie's stomach growled despite her nerves. A handful of men occupied the tables and bar, their conversations creating a low rumble that stuttered and died as she stepped inside. "Well, well," a woman's voice rang out, sweet as poisoned honey. "Look what the prairie wind blew in." The speaker stood behind the bar, all sharp angles and calculating eyes, her dark hair piled high and her dress cut low enough to advertise her wares. She wiped a glass with a cloth that had seen better days, her smile fixed and venomous. "I'm Viola Kane," the woman said. "I own this establishment. And you are?" "Margaret Turner," Maggie said, keeping her voice level. "I'm looking for supper, if you're serving." "Oh, we're serving." Viola's eyes traveled slowly down Maggie's frame and back up, the kind of assessment that felt like being scraped with a dull knife. "Though by the looks of you, honey, you've been well fed for quite some time." Laughter rippled through the room, not loud, not cruel enough to be called outright mockery, but there, present, poisonous. Maggie's face burned, but she held her ground. "Beef stew, if you have it, and bread." "Stew's 2 bits. Bread's extra." Viola turned away, dismissing her, and called through a door to the back. "Charlie, 1 bowl of yesterday's stew for the new girl." Maggie found a table in the corner, the kind of spot she'd learned to claim in unfamiliar places. Out of the main traffic, back to the wall, exit in view. The stew, when it came delivered by a skinny boy with averted eyes, was thin and lukewarm, the bread hard enough to serve as a weapon. But Maggie ate it anyway, because she'd paid for it, and because she'd learned long ago not to waste food. "You the one who came for the Thornton job?" a man at the next table asked. He was older, weathered, with the look of someone who'd spent more years under the sun than under a roof. "I was," Maggie said carefully. "Shame they already filled it," the man said, and he sounded like he almost meant it. "Though I reckon Thornton was looking for someone a bit more, decorative for his dining room." "Decorative," Maggie repeated, the word tasting like ash. The man shrugged. "It's honest work feeding rich folks, but presentation matters to that crowd. You know how it is?" Maggie knew. She'd always known. The world had been explaining it to her since she was 12 years old and realized that the softness her mother called pleasantly plump was going to define every room she entered for the rest of her life. She finished her meal in silence, paid her 2 bits, and walked back to Duffy's mercantile as the sky turned purple and the first stars pricked through. In her small room, she lit the lamp and opened her carpet bag to retrieve the novel she'd been reading on the journey. A romance where the heroine was beautiful and beloved and got her happy ending. Maggie read 3 pages before she closed the book and set it aside. Fairy tales were for people who believed in them. Instead, she pulled out paper and pencil and began making lists. Jobs in Dry Creek. Skills she could offer, how long her money would last if she was careful. Numbers and plans were safer than dreams. They couldn't disappoint you the same way. She was still writing when she heard the commotion outside. Boots on the boardwalk, men's voices raised in greeting, the jingle of spurs and creak of saddle leather. Maggie moved to the window and looked down into the street where 3 riders had tied their horses outside the saloon. The first 2 were ranch hands, recognizable by their dusty clothes and easy familiarity with each other. But the third man made Maggie's breath catch. He was massive, not fat, nothing soft about him at all, but built on a scale that made the other men look like boys. Broad shoulders strained the fabric of his work shirt, and arms thick as fence posts hung at his sides. His face was all hard planes and dark beard, shadowed under his hat brim, and he moved with the particular economy of motion that came from a lifetime of physical labor. "That's Caleb Rourke," a voice said behind her. Maggie jumped, spinning to find Duffy standing in her doorway, a stack of blankets in his arms. "Sorry to startle you," Duffy said. "Thought you might want an extra blanket. Nights get cold this time of year." He set the blankets on her bed, then moved to the window, looking down at the street. "Caleb Rourke," he repeated, nodding toward the big man. "Got a ranch about 8 miles north of town. Keeps to himself mostly. Lost his wife 2 years back, and he hasn't been quite right since." "That's terrible," Maggie said softly. "It is," Duffy agreed. "She was a tiny thing, Alice Rourke. Sweet-natured. Died in childbed, the baby too. Damn shame." He shook his head. "Caleb's been running that ranch alone ever since, except for a couple of hands who do the rough work. Place is going to seed without a woman's touch." Maggie watched as Caleb Rourke tied his horse and stood for a moment, his hand on the animal's neck, before following his men into the saloon. There was something in the set of his shoulders, a weight, a weariness that went bone deep. "Why are you telling me this?" Maggie asked. Duffy was quiet for a moment. "Because I lied to you earlier," he said finally. "The Thornton position wasn't filled. They took one look at your description on the telegram and decided they wanted someone else. I'm sorry for that." Maggie's throat tightened. "Why are you apologizing? You didn't make the decision." "No, but I went along with it. That was cowardice." Duffy moved toward the door, then paused. "If you're looking for work, you might try Caleb. I know he needs a cook. His men complain about the food every time they come to town. But fair warning, he doesn't talk much, and he's got a temper when he's pushed. Most folks give him a wide berth these days." After Duffy left, Maggie stood at the window for a long time, watching the saloon door. When Caleb Rourke finally emerged an hour later, she noticed 2 things. He drank slower than his companions, and Viola Kane, who draped herself over half the men in the bar during that hour, didn't go near him. Maybe, Maggie thought, people who'd been hurt learned to recognize each other. The next morning dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the wooden boardwalks. Maggie dressed in her best day dress, navy wool, carefully mended with buttons she'd polished until they shone, and braided her hair into a coronet that added a veneer of respectability. Then she walked through Dry Creek with her shoulders back and her head high, even as she felt every glance like a touch she hadn't invited. The livery stable owner needed someone to muck stalls, but when Maggie offered, he looked her up and down and said he needed someone who could move quick and fit through tight spaces. The seamstress claimed she did all her own work. The pastor's wife said she'd keep Maggie in mind, with the particular emphasis that meant she wouldn't. By noon, Maggie had exhausted every business in town and circled back to Duffy's mercantile to buy supplies for the room: flour, salt pork, dried beans, the cheapest staples that would stretch her dwindling funds. She was paying when Viola Kane swept in, trailing perfume and malice. "Well, If it isn't our new resident, Viola said, her voice carrying to every corner of the store. Have you found employment yet, honey? Or are you planning to eat your way through your savings until someone gets desperate enough to hire you? Maggie's hand stilled on her purchases. I'm looking, she said quietly. Looking, Viola laughed, the sound like breaking glass. Let me save you some time, sweetheart. In a town this size, there's only so many jobs, and most of them require a certain presentation. Men want something pretty to look at, whether they're drinking whiskey or eating supper. A girl your size? You'll scare off the customers before they're halfway through the door. Viola, Duffy said sharply, that's enough. I'm just being honest, Viola said, examining her nails. Someone needs to tell her how things work out here. This isn't St. Louis, where a big girl can hide in some boarding house kitchen. On the frontier, we're all on display. Maggie gathered her purchases with trembling hands, her face burning hot enough to start fires. She managed to keep her voice steady when she thanked Duffy, managed to walk out of the store instead of running, but once she was back in her small room, she sank onto the bed and let the tears come. She cried for the job that never existed, for the money running through her fingers like water, for every snide comment and pitying look and casual cruelty she'd endured in 26 years of taking up too much space in a world that wanted women to be small and quiet and easy to overlook. When the tears finally stopped, Maggie washed her face in cold water from the basin and looked at herself in the small mirror. Red eyes, blotchy cheeks, a face that would never be called beautiful, but capable hands, strong arms, a mind that could organize a kitchen, plan meals for 30, and turn nothing into something good. She'd survived worse than Dry Creek, Montana. She'd survived her father walking out when she was 8, saying he couldn't bear to look at a daughter who'd gotten her mother's size along with her eyes. She'd survived schoolrooms where girls whispered elephant when she walked past. She'd survived St. Louis, where even kindly Mrs. Henderson had gently suggested that Maggie might do better if she ate less and smiled more. She could survive this. That afternoon, Maggie did what she always did when the world felt too heavy. She cooked. Using the small spirit stove she'd brought from St. Louis, she made biscuits that filled the room with the smell of butter and salt and home. She made a stew from the salt pork and beans seasoned with the precious herbs from her tin. She cooked until the small room felt warm and safe, until the act of creating something good pushed back against the day's accumulated wounds. She was eating her supper, good food, better than anything the saloon had served, when she heard the commotion outside again. Horses, men's voices, and beneath it all, a rumble so low and quiet she almost missed it. Maggie moved to the window and looked down. Caleb Rourke stood in the street, his hat in his hands, talking to Duffy. Or rather, Duffy was talking, gesturing animatedly, while Caleb listened with the stillness of a man who'd learned that silence was easier than speech. Then Duffy pointed up at her window. Maggie jerked back, her heart hammering, but not before Caleb Rourke's eyes had found hers. Even from this distance, she could see they were dark, brown, or maybe gray, and unreadable as stone. 5 minutes later, someone knocked on her door. Maggie opened it to find Duffy standing in the hall, looking pleased with himself in a way that made her nervous. "Miss Turner," he said, "Caleb Rourke is downstairs. He'd like a word with you if you're willing." "About what?" Maggie's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "About a job," Duffy said. "I might have mentioned that you're a cook looking for work, and that his place could use someone with your skills. The rest is up to you and him." Maggie's hands went to her hair, smoothing flyaways that didn't exist, then dropped to her sides. "Tell him I'll be right down." She waited until Duffy's footsteps faded, then took a breath so deep it made her ribs ache. This was it. The last chance in Dry Creek, and maybe the last chance for a long while after. She descended the stairs with her spine straight and her fear locked behind her teeth. Caleb Rourke stood in the mercantile like a mountain transported indoors, too large for the space, his presence making the shelves and counters shrink around him. Up close, Maggie could see the weathering on his face, lines carved by sun and wind and grief, a beard that needed trimming, and those eyes that held the kind of emptiness that came from losing something you couldn't get back. "Miss Turner," he said. His voice matched his frame, deep, rough, like stones grinding together. "Mr. Rourke." They stood there for a moment, two people who'd learned not to expect much from the world, sizing each other up in the fading afternoon light. "Duffy says you're a cook," Caleb finally said. "I am." "Says you're looking for work." "I am," Maggie repeated. "I need a cook," Caleb said slowly, as if he was testing each word before releasing it. "My ranch is 8 miles north. I've got a house that needs cleaning, a kitchen that's been dead for 2 years, and 2 ranch hands who are about to mutiny over beans and hardtack. Room and board, and $30 a month." $30. More than Maggie had hoped for, more than most cooking jobs paid. Why? The word escaped before she could stop it. Caleb's eyebrows drew together. Why what? Why offer me the job? Maggie's heart pounded, but she'd learned long ago that false hope hurt worse than honest refusal. "You haven't tasted my cooking. You don't know if I'm reliable or clean or—" "Duffy vouched for you," Caleb interrupted. "That's enough." "But—" Maggie gestured helplessly at herself, at the body that had cost her every other opportunity in this town. "You haven't even— Everyone else took one look and—" "I'm looking now," Caleb said, and there was something in his voice, impatience, maybe, or weariness, that stopped her spiral. "I need someone who can cook 3 meals a day for 3 men and keep a house from falling apart. Duffy says you can do that, can you?" "Yes," Maggie said. "Yes, I can do that." "Then the job's yours if you want it." Maggie stared at him, this giant of a man who'd looked at her exactly once and seen past everything the rest of the town had used to measure her worth. She thought about her dwindling money, about Viola Kane's poison-sweet predictions, about the long journey back to St. Louis and the admission of failure it would require. "I want it," she said. "Come Monday, then," Caleb said. He settled his hat back on his head and turned toward the door, then paused. "Fair warning, Miss Turner. I'm not much for talking, and the ranch is 8 miles from anywhere. It's lonely work." "Mr. Rourke," Maggie said, and he turned back. She met his eyes, those empty gray-brown depths, and spoke the truth that had been pressing against her ribs since he'd made his offer. "I can cook and clean and work hard. And you won't have to look at me much if you don't want to. I know how to stay out of the way." Something shifted in Caleb's face, not quite an expression, more like a wall cracking. He was quiet for so long that Maggie wondered if she'd offended him, if honesty had just cost her this last chance. Then he said, "Monday," and walked out into the cold Montana evening. Maggie stood in the mercantile, her pulse still hammering, and felt something unfamiliar kindle in her chest. Not quite hope. She'd learned better than that. But possibility, maybe. A door cracking open when she'd thought they'd all been sealed shut. Outside, the sun set over Dry Creek in shades of fire and gold, and Margaret Turner allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that perhaps the worst wasn't yet to come. Perhaps instead, she was standing at the edge of something different. Perhaps this time the story wouldn't end with her running. Monday morning arrived wrapped in fog, the kind that turned the prairie into a ghost world where distances disappeared and sounds carried strange. Maggie stood on the boardwalk outside Duffy's mercantile, with her trunk at her feet and her carpet bag clutched in both hands, watching the mist for the shape of a wagon that might or might not come. She'd spent Sunday packing her few possessions and ignoring the knot in her stomach that whispered this was a mistake, that Caleb Rourke would come to his senses and leave her standing here like every other promise that had dissolved under scrutiny. But when the fog finally parted, there he was, a dark figure on a wagon seat, 2 horses pulling steady through the murk. Caleb didn't greet her, just climbed down and lifted her trunk like it weighed nothing, settling it in the wagon bed with a thump that spoke of strength held carefully in check. When he reached for her carpet bag, Maggie shook her head. "I can hold it." He studied her for a moment, then nodded and climbed back onto the seat. Maggie hauled herself up beside him, acutely aware of how the wagon dipped under her weight, how much space she occupied on the bench. But Caleb just gathered the reins and clicked his tongue, and the horses moved forward into a landscape that seemed to exist only in shades of gray. They rode in silence, not the comfortable quiet of 2 people at ease with each other, but the careful hush of strangers who hadn't yet learned what words were safe to exchange. Maggie kept her hands folded on her carpet bag, and watched the fog slowly burn away, revealing a land so vast it made her chest ache. Rolling plains stretched to horizons that seemed impossibly distant, broken only by occasional stands of cottonwood marking where water ran. The sky overhead was enormous, pale blue bleeding through the last wisps of mist, and the silence was so complete she could hear the creak of the wagon wheels and the horses' steady breathing. After an hour, Caleb spoke. "Creek runs year-round through the property," he said, nodding toward a line of trees in the distance. "House is built on a rise above the floodplain. You'll have good water for cooking and washing." "That's good," Maggie said, because the silence needed filling and she didn't know what else to offer. Another mile passed before Caleb spoke again. "The men eat at 6, noon, and 7. They're not particular about fancy food, but they work hard and they need fuel. Breakfast is usually biscuits and gravy, bacon if we've got it. Dinner's whatever you can make stretch. Supper's the main meal. Meat, potatoes, bread." "I understand," Maggie said. "What about you? Do you eat with the men?" "Mostly." Caleb's hands shifted on the reins. "Sometimes I eat in the house, if the work keeps me close." Which meant, Maggie translated, that he preferred his own company to conversation. She understood that impulse better than most. The ranch appeared gradually as they crested a low rise, a collection of buildings arranged in the practical geometry of frontier living. The main house was larger than Maggie had expected, built from hewn logs and painted white where the paint hadn't peeled away. A barn stood to the east, solid and well-maintained, with a corral beside it where horses watched their approach with pricked ears. A bunkhouse, a chicken coop, a root cellar with its distinctive earthen mound, all the pieces of a working ranch, held together by routine and labor. But even from a distance, Maggie could see the signs of neglect. Weeds grew tall against the house foundation. One of the porch steps sagged. The windows, at least the ones she could see, looked dim with dust and disuse. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and set the brake. "This is it," he said, and Maggie heard something in his voice she couldn't quite name. Resignation, maybe. Or the particular shame that came from knowing your home had fallen apart while you'd been too lost in grief to notice. "It's a good house," Maggie said, because it was true. Beneath the neglect, she could see solid construction, good bones, the kind of place that would last generations if someone cared enough to maintain it. Caleb made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been doubt, then climbed down and reached for her trunk again. Maggie followed, her feet finding purchase on ground that felt solid in a way town boardwalks never had. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper, carrying the scent of grass and distance and wood smoke from somewhere beyond the barn. The front door stuck, swollen with disuse, and Caleb had to put his shoulder into it before it scraped open. Inside, the house held the particular stillness of a place where nothing moved, where time had simply stopped and left everything frozen in the moment of its abandonment. The main room was large, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and windows on either side that would have let in good light if they'd been clean. Furniture stood arranged as it must have been 2 years ago. A sofa, 2 chairs, a table with 4 seats around it. Everything was covered in dust thick enough to write your name in, and the air tasted stale, as if the house itself had stopped breathing when Alice Rourke did. "Kitchen's through here," Caleb said, moving toward a door at the back of the room. His voice had gone flat, and Maggie understood. This was the worst part for him, showing a stranger the physical evidence of how far he'd fallen from whatever life he'd built with his wife. The kitchen was both better and worse than Maggie had imagined. The room itself was well designed. A good cast-iron stove, a deep sink with a pump handle, shelves and a pantry, and a workbench worn smooth by use. But everything wore the same blanket of dust and neglect. Pots hung from their hooks filmed with grime. The stove was cold and dead, its surface spotted with rust. The pantry, when Maggie opened it, held a few sad jars of preserves, their contents long since spoiled. "Alice kept it nice," Caleb said quietly, and the past tense hit Maggie like a fist. "I can see that," Maggie said, running her hand along the workbench and feeling the quality of the wood beneath the dirt. "She must have been a good cook." She was. Caleb stood in the doorway like a man at a funeral, unable to enter, but unable to leave. "She made bread every Tuesday. The whole house would smell like it. The men would come up from the barn just to catch the scent." Maggie waited, sensing there was more. that grief had opened a door in Caleb's careful silence. She used to sing while she worked, he continued, his voice rough. I'd be out in the barn, and I'd hear her voice carrying through the windows. Not good singing, mind you. Alice couldn't carry a tune to save her life, but it made the house feel alive. The silence that followed was heavy with everything Caleb couldn't say. How the house had died with his wife. How he'd let it happen because living in the corpse of his former life was easier than facing what came next. How he'd spent 2 years existing instead of living because anything else hurt too much. Mr. Rourke, Maggie said carefully, I need to know, do you want me to make this kitchen like it was before? Or can I arrange things my own way? Caleb's jaw worked, and for a moment Maggie thought she'd pushed too hard, asked for too much. Then he said, do what you need to. Just make it work again. He left then, his boots heavy on the floorboards, and Maggie was alone in Alice Rourke's kitchen with the ghost of a woman she'd never meet and the weight of expectations she didn't fully understand. She stood there for a full minute, taking in the scope of the work ahead, feeling the familiar flutter of panic that came with new places and new responsibilities. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got started, because work was always the answer when thinking became too dangerous. First, she opened every window in the kitchen, letting fresh air pour through to chase out the staleness. Then she pumped water until it ran clear, filled the largest pot she could find, and set it to heat on the stove, which meant building a fire in a firebox that hadn't seen flame in who knew how long. She cleaned the stove first, scraping away rust and old ash, checking the flue and the dampers until she understood the machine's temperament. Only then did she light the fire, using kindling from the box beside the hearth and watching carefully as the flames caught and held. While the water heated, Maggie explored. The pantry yielded little of use. The spoiled preserves, some flour so old it had gone rancid, dried beans that looked like they might have predated the Montana Territory. But the shelves themselves were good, and the space was well ventilated. She could work with this. The root cellar, accessed through a door off the kitchen, was in better shape. Cool and dark, it held a few shriveled potatoes, some onions going soft, and nothing else. But the structure was sound, the temperature stable, and Maggie's mind was already filling the empty shelves with the abundance she'd create once she had supplies to work with. By the time the water was hot enough to use, Maggie had formed a plan. She spent the rest of the morning scrubbing counters, shelves, the workbench, every surface she'd need to prepare food safely. The water turned gray, then black, then gray again as she worked through bucket after bucket, carrying each one out to dump in the yard and returning for more. Her back ached, her hands grew raw, but the kitchen began to emerge from under its shroud of abandonment. She was elbow-deep in soapy water, scrubbing the inside of the pantry, when she heard voices outside. Male voices, low and curious. Boss really hired a cook? That's what he said. Woman from town, supposed to start today. About damn time. I'm so sick of beans I'm starting to look like one. Laughter, rough and tired. Then a third voice, younger than the others. What's she like? A pause. Then the first voice again, careful now. Big woman, real big. Saw her getting off the stage last week. Half the town was talking about it. Maggie's hands stilled in the water. Here it was, the commentary she'd been bracing for since Caleb had driven away after unloading her trunk. Big how? The young voice asked. Big how do you think? Fat. Takes up space like 2 normal women. Viola Kane was making jokes about needing to reinforce the floorboards. More laughter, but uncomfortable now, as if the men weren't sure whether cruelty was acceptable here or if loyalty to their employer's choice required them to pretend not to notice. Well, if she can cook better than Caleb, I don't care if she's big as the barn, the second voice said firmly. Man can build a fence and break a horse, but he can't boil water without burning it. I've lost 5 pounds this winter. Amen to that, the first voice agreed. Come on, let's see if the boss needs help with the south fence. Give the woman some space to settle in. The voices faded, boots crunching on gravel as the men headed toward the barn. Maggie stood in the pantry, her hands dripping soapy water onto the floor, and felt the familiar burn of shame settle behind her breastbone. It never got easier hearing herself discussed like livestock. Never stopped hurting, no matter how many times she told herself their opinions didn't matter. But then she thought about what the second man had said. If she can cook better than Caleb, I don't care if she's big as the barn, and felt something shift. Here, maybe, her worth would be measured in biscuits and gravy instead of inches around her waist. Here, maybe, she could earn respect the same way she always had, through competence, through making herself necessary, through being so good at what she did that people forgot to care what she looked like. Maybe. Maggie dried her hands and went back to work. By early afternoon, the kitchen had been transformed. Not perfect, that would take days of steady effort, but functional, clean, ready. Maggie stood in the center of the room and felt, for the first time since arriving in Montana, like she'd accomplished something tangible. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since the biscuit and coffee she'd had at dawn. She checked the pantry again, taking inventory of what little remained. Half a sack of flour that seemed relatively fresh, lard, salt, a bit of sugar, some coffee that smelled like it might still be good. Not much, but enough. She built up the fire in the stove and set to work making biscuits, real ones, with the kind of care she'd learned from the one good cooking teacher she'd ever had. She mixed the flour and lard with her hands, feeling for the right texture, adding just enough water to bring the dough together without overworking it. She shaped each biscuit by hand, arranging them in a pan she'd scrubbed 3 times to get clean, and slid them into the oven to bake. While the biscuits cooked, she made coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and fried the last of the salt pork she'd brought from her room in town. Not much of a meal, but honest food made with clean hands in a clean kitchen, and that counted for something. She was pulling the biscuits from the oven, golden brown, perfect, the smell filling the kitchen like a promise. When Caleb appeared in the doorway, he stopped there, his hand on the frame, and just stared. "I made lunch," Maggie said, suddenly uncertain. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to eat now or later, but I thought, I needed to test the stove anyway, and it smells like bread," Caleb said, and his voice carried a weight that made Maggie's throat tighten. "Biscuits," she corrected gently. "They're better hot. There's coffee too, and a bit of salt pork." Caleb moved into the kitchen like a man walking through a dream, his eyes taking in the clean surfaces, the organized shelves, the fire burning steady in the stove. He stopped at the workbench where Maggie had laid out the food and picked up one of the biscuits, turning it in his large, scarred hands. "When did you do all this?" he asked. "This morning. It's not finished. There's still a lot of work to do, but the kitchen's functional now. I'll need to go into town for supplies soon. The pantry's nearly empty." Caleb split the biscuit open and steam rose from the tender interior. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and closed his eyes. "Good?" Maggie asked, hating how much she needed the answer. "Better than good," Caleb said. He opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, and Maggie saw something in his face that made her heart stumble. Not attraction, she'd learned not to hope for that, but recognition, maybe. Respect. "Thank you, Miss Turner." "It's just biscuits," Maggie said, uncomfortable with gratitude she didn't know how to accept. "It's not just biscuits." Caleb set the remains of his biscuit down and gestured at the kitchen around them. "This room's been dead for 2 years. You brought it back to life in a morning. That's not nothing." Before Maggie could respond, boots sounded on the porch, and 2 men appeared in the doorway, drawn by the smell of bread like hounds to a scent. "Boss, we finished with the first man stopped mid-sentence, his eyes going wide. He was lean and weathered, maybe 40, with the kind of face that had spent more time squinting into sun than sleeping in shade. "Is that biscuits?" "Miss Turner," Caleb said, "these are my ranch hands, Pete Holloway and Ben Masters. They work hard and they're always hungry. Pete, Ben, this is Margaret Turner. She's the new cook." Pete, the lean one, swept off his hat and nodded. "Ma'am, it's a real pleasure." Ben, younger and built like a scarecrow with the same wind-worn look as his companion, just stared at the biscuits with the expression of a man seeing salvation. "There's enough for everyone," Maggie said. "Help yourselves." She didn't need to say it twice. The men descended on the food with the enthusiasm of people who'd been living on beans and hardtack, and the sounds they made while eating would have been comical if they hadn't been so genuinely grateful. "Ma'am," Pete said through a mouthful of biscuit, "you just became my favorite person in Montana." "Don't talk with your mouth full," Ben said. then proceeded to stuff another entire biscuit into his own mouth. Caleb watched his men eat with something that might have been amusement flickering behind his careful expression. "Easy, boys. She'll think we haven't fed you in weeks." "Might as well not have," Pete said. "No offense, boss, but your cooking could kill a man slower than poison and twice as painful." "None taken," Caleb said dryly. "It's why I hired Miss Turner." The men finished the biscuits in minutes, scraping the last crumbs from the pan, then stood looking at Maggie like she'd performed a miracle instead of basic cooking. "Miss Turner," Pete said seriously, "whatever the boss is paying you, it ain't enough. You just let me know if you need anything, firewood, water hauled, supplies from town, and I'll get it done." "Me too," Ben added. "Anything you need, ma'am." "I'll keep that in mind," Maggie said, trying not to smile at their earnest faces. After the men left, Caleb lingered. "They mean it," he said, "about helping. They're good men." "I can tell," Maggie said. She began gathering the empty plates, her hands needing something to do. "Miss Turner," Caleb's voice stopped her. "I should tell you, there'll be talk about me hiring you. The town's already got opinions, and they won't keep them to themselves." Maggie's hand stilled on the plates. "I know, I heard some of it before I left." "It won't be kind. It never is," Maggie said quietly. "But I've dealt with unkind talk before, Mr. Rourke. I'm tougher than I look." Caleb studied her for a long moment. "I believe that," he said finally. "But just so you know, what they say doesn't matter out here. On this ranch, you'll be judged by your work, not by anything else. That's my promise to you." Maggie met his eyes and saw he meant it, this mountain of a man who'd given her a chance when no one else would. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in ways she couldn't articulate. Caleb nodded and turned to go, then paused at the doorway. "Your room's upstairs, second door on the right. It was the spare bedroom. I put your trunk up there this morning. If you need anything else, let me know." After he left, Maggie stood alone in the kitchen and felt something unfamiliar settling into her bones. Not quite peace, she hadn't earned that yet, but a tentative sense of rightness, of being in a place where she might actually belong. She climbed the stairs to investigate her new quarters, her legs protesting the morning's labor. The room Caleb had given her was plain but adequate. A real bed with a decent mattress, a dresser with a mirror, a window that looked out over the prairie toward the distant line of mountains. Better than the rented room above Duffy's Mercantile. Better than most places she'd lived. Maggie unpacked her few possessions, hanging her dresses and arranging her small treasures with the particular care of someone who'd learned that home wasn't a place but a collection of objects that traveled with you. When everything was in its place, she stood at the window and watched the afternoon sun paint the grasslands in shades of gold and amber. 8 miles from town. 8 miles from Viola Kane's poisoned smiles and the town's measuring eyes. 8 miles from every place that had told her she didn't fit. Maybe, Maggie thought, distance was exactly what she'd needed all along. The next days fell into a rhythm that felt like learning a new language. Unfamiliar at first, but gradually becoming clearer with practice. Maggie rose before dawn to start the stove and prepare breakfast for men who worked from sunrise to sunset and needed fuel to sustain them. Biscuits and gravy became her signature, but she varied it with pancakes, fried potatoes, eggs when the hens cooperated, and bacon when supplies allowed. The men ate with the focused intensity of people who understood that good food was both pleasure and necessity, and their praise, simple, honest, frequent, settled into Maggie's chest like warm stones. They'd arrive in the kitchen with dirt under their nails and gratitude in their eyes, and they'd leave with full bellies and the kind of contentment that came from being genuinely cared for. Caleb ate with them most mornings, sitting at the head of the table and saying little, but Maggie learned to read him anyway. The way he'd linger over his coffee meant the work ahead was particularly hard. The slight relaxation in his shoulders meant something had gone right with the cattle or the fences. The careful way he'd compliment her cooking, never effusive, just a quiet, "Good meal, Miss Turner," meant more than he probably realized. Between meals, Maggie attacked the house with the same methodical determination she'd brought to the kitchen. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, beat rugs until clouds of dust filled the yard. She found linens packed away in a chest and washed them in the creek, hanging them to dry in the sun until they smelled like fresh air and possibility. She discovered Alice Rourke's preserving jars in the cellar and spent an afternoon washing them, imagining the rows of vegetables and fruit she'd put up when summer came. The house slowly came back to life, room by room, and if Caleb noticed, he didn't say. But Maggie caught him sometimes standing in doorways, looking at spaces that had been dead and were now clean and functional, and she wondered what he was remembering. On her fourth day at the ranch, Pete drove her into Dry Creek for supplies. They took the wagon, and Pete kept up a steady stream of conversation that required minimal response, perfect for someone like Maggie, who was still learning how to exist in this new place. "Ben's the quiet one usually," Pete said as they rolled across the prairie. "Lost his folks to cholera when he was 15 and kind of forgot how to talk for a while. But he's a good hand, works hard, never complains." "He seems like a good person," Maggie said. "He is. We both are, or we try to be. Boss doesn't tolerate meanness, not toward animals or people. He's rough around the edges, but he's fair. And since Alice died, well, he's been lost. But maybe less lost now that you're here." Maggie glanced at Pete. "I just cooked, Mr. Holloway. I'm not a miracle worker." "You're feeding him real food and making the house smell like a home again," Pete said. "Out here, ma'am, that's close enough to a miracle for most folks." When they reached Dry Creek, Pete helped her down from the wagon and followed her into Duffy's mercantile with the protective air of a man who'd been given instructions. Duffy greeted them warmly, his pleasure at seeing Maggie genuine, and together they filled her list: flour, sugar, salt, lard, coffee, dried beans, rice, canned tomatoes, spices, everything she'd need to feed 3 men through the coming weeks. They were loading the supplies into the wagon when Viola Kane appeared, dressed in emerald silk that seemed obscene in the harsh morning light. "Well, well," Viola said, her voice carrying across the street. "The ranch cook, out shopping. How domestic." Pete stiffened beside Maggie, his hand tightening on the sack of flour he was holding. "Miss Kane," he said, his tone ice cold. "Mr. Holloway." Viola's smile was all teeth. "How's life out at the Rourke place? I hear you've got a new addition to the household. Must be quite an adjustment having someone so substantial around." "Miss Turner's the best cook in Montana," Pete said flatly. "We're lucky to have her." "Oh, I'm sure you are," Viola purred. She turned her attention to Maggie, looking her up and down with the kind of assessment that felt like violence. "Tell me, dear, does Caleb Rourke still eat in the house, or has he started taking his meals in the barn to avoid the view?" Maggie felt her face burn, but before she could respond, Pete stepped between them. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Miss Turner's under Mr. Rourke's protection, which means she's under ours too. You want to sling mud, you do it somewhere else." Viola's eyes narrowed. "Protective, aren't we? Careful, Pete. People might think you're sweet on the help. People might think you're a miserable woman who gets her kicks making others feel small," Pete shot back. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we've got work to do." He took Maggie's arm and guided her to the wagon, loading the last of the supplies with hands that shook slightly with suppressed anger. When they were finally heading out of town, he looked over at her. "I apologize for Viola Kane, ma'am. She's poison in a pretty dress, and she's been making life hell for decent folks since she bought that saloon." "It's not your fault," Maggie said quietly, "but thank you for defending me." "Boss would skin me if I didn't," Pete said, "but I didn't do it because he told me to. I did it because it was right." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Miss Turner, I hope you know what Viola said about Caleb avoiding you or being ashamed or whatever nastiness she was implying. It's not true. Boss doesn't talk much, but when he does, he speaks well of you. Says you've brought life back to a place that was dying." Maggie's throat tightened. "He said that?" "More or less. You know how he is with words, gets them out like pulling teeth. But the meaning was clear." Pete glanced at her. "You're doing good work out there, ma'am. Don't let town gossip make you doubt that." That evening, Maggie prepared supper with extra care. Roasted chicken with herbs, mashed potatoes rich with butter, carrots glazed with honey, and bread so fresh it steamed when she cut into it. The men ate with their usual enthusiasm, but Caleb was quieter than normal, his eyes distant. After the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes were washed, Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Pete told me what happened in town," he said without preamble. Maggie's hand stilled on the towel she'd been folding. It was nothing. It wasn't nothing. Caleb moved into the kitchen, and Maggie was struck again by how much space he occupied, how his presence seemed to fill whatever room he entered. Viola Kane's been a problem for a long time. She enjoys cruelty, and she's good at finding people's weak spots. I'm used to it, Maggie said quietly. You shouldn't have to be. Caleb's jaw tightened. You work for me, Miss Turner. That means you're under my protection. If she bothers you again, I want to know about it. Mr. Rourke, Caleb, he interrupted. Out here, we don't stand on formality. You call me Caleb, I'll call you Maggie, if that's all right with you. That's all right, Maggie said, testing the name in her mind. Caleb, rough and strong, like the man himself. Good. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then said, I want you to know something. I didn't hire you because I was desperate or because I pitied you or any of the other things people in town are probably saying. I hired you because Duffy vouched for you and because when I looked at you, I saw someone who understood what it meant to be judged unfairly. Maggie's breath caught. What do you mean? Caleb gestured at himself. The massive frame, the scarred hands, the face that had probably frightened more people than it had comforted. People look at me and see a brute, someone to be careful around. They've been doing it my whole life. After Alice died, it got worse. Suddenly, I was a dangerous brute, someone unstable, someone to whisper about. So when I saw you in that mercantile, saw the way you were bracing yourself for rejection, I recognized it. I know what it's like to have people measure you by inches and pounds instead of by what you can do. I never thought about it that way, Maggie said softly. Most people don't. Caleb moved to the window, looking out at the darkening prairie. Alice was the first person who looked past my size and saw me. Really saw me. When she died, I figured that was it. I'd had my chance at being seen, and I wouldn't get another. He turned back to Maggie. But watching you work these past days, watching you bring this house back to life, it reminded me that being seen isn't about romance or marriage or any of that. It's about respect, about recognizing someone's worth. You gave me that, Maggie said, her voice thick. When everyone else in Dry Creek had already decided I wasn't worth their time, you saw past it. I won't forget that. Don't forget it, Caleb said. But also don't think you owe me anything beyond good work. You're earning your keep 10 times over. The men are happier, the house is coming alive again, and for the first time in 2 years, I don't dread coming inside. He left then, his boots heavy on the stairs as he climbed to his own room, and Maggie stood in the warm kitchen surrounded by the evidence of her labor and felt tears prick her eyes. Not sad tears. Something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope taking root. Outside, the prairie night settled in with its vast silence and ocean of stars. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The wind whispered through the grass. And in the house on the rise above the floodplain, Margaret Turner allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found a place where the worst of the world couldn't quite reach her, where she could be necessary, be valued, be seen, where she could, at last, begin to build something that looked like home. 3 weeks passed like pages turning in a book Maggie was afraid to read too fast, worried the story might end before she was ready. The rhythm of ranch life became her heartbeat, rise before dawn, coax the stove to life, fill the kitchen with warmth and the smell of bread. Feed the men who worked until their hands bled and never complained. Clean, mend, preserve, prepare. Fall into bed exhausted and wake to do it all again. But somewhere in the repetition, something shifted. The house stopped feeling like Alice Rourke's ghost and started feeling like Maggie's domain. She rearranged the pantry to suit her workflow, hung her good knife where she could reach it easily, and placed a small jar of wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill because the spot needed color. When Caleb came in one evening and paused at the sight of those flowers, purple lupine and yellow prairie roses, Maggie held her breath, waiting for him to say she'd overstepped. Instead, he said, Alice used to do that, put flowers in that exact spot, and walked away before she could respond, leaving Maggie to wonder if she'd crossed an invisible line or somehow honored a memory she hadn't known existed. The next morning, she found a bundle of herbs on the workbench, sage and wild thyme tied with string. No note, no explanation, just the herbs and the faint smell of prairie wind that meant Caleb had been up early, gathering them for her. Maggie hung them to dry from the kitchen rafters and felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something that felt dangerously like belonging. The men had stopped being strangers. Pete would appear in the kitchen mid-afternoon with updates about the ranch delivered in his steady, easy way. The fence in the north pasture needed replacing. One of the mares was due to foal soon. The cattle were grazing well on the high grass. He never asked for food, but Maggie always had something ready. Leftover biscuits, a slice of cake, cookies she'd made with the last of the sugar. Pete would eat standing up, talking the whole time, and leave with the kind of genuine smile that made Maggie feel less alone in the world. Ben was quieter, but his gratitude showed in different ways. He'd appear at dawn to haul water before she had to ask, stack firewood by the kitchen door without a word, and once, just once, he'd left a perfect robin's egg on the windowsill, blue as summer sky, because he'd found it and thought she might like it. Maggie kept it in a small bowl on the dresser in her room, a tangible reminder that kindness existed in unexpected forms. And Caleb was becoming something Maggie didn't have words for yet. He still didn't talk much, but his silence had changed texture, less like a wall and more like a presence, solid and constant. He'd started eating breakfast in the house instead of with the men, sitting at the table with his coffee while Maggie worked, and sometimes he'd speak into the quiet with observations about the weather or the herd or repairs that needed doing. Not conversation exactly, but communication, an acknowledgement that she existed beyond her function as cook. One morning, as Maggie was kneading bread dough, Caleb said, "The knives are sharper." Maggie looked up, flour dusting her forearms. "I noticed. Thank you. Figured you'd work faster with good tools." Caleb took a sip of his coffee. "Alice used to complain that I let them get dull. She was right." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife without grief thickening his voice, and Maggie understood what a gift that was. Not forgetting, but being able to remember without bleeding. "She sounds like she was practical," Maggie said carefully. She was. Practical and stubborn, and absolutely certain she was right about everything. The corner of Caleb's mouth lifted. Most of the time she was. "What was she like?" Maggie asked, then immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry, you don't have to, small she," Caleb said. "Tiny, really. She barely came up to my chest and she weighed less than a sack of grain, but she had this way of looking at you that made you feel like she could see straight through to your bones." He was quiet for a moment. "She chose me. That's what I never understood. I was 30 years old, looked like someone you'd cross the street to avoid, and she chose me anyway. Said she liked that I was quiet because she talked enough for both of us." "She sounds wonderful," Maggie said softly. She was. Caleb set his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "But she's gone, and I'm still here, and I'm learning that life doesn't stop just because you want it to." He stood, settling his hat on his head. "Good bread, Maggie. The men will eat it all before noon." After he left, Maggie stood at her workbench with flour-covered hands and felt tears prick her eyes. Not sad tears, not entirely, something more complicated. Grief for the woman she'd never meet, gratitude for the trust Caleb was learning to extend, and beneath it all, a dangerous flutter of something that felt like hope, wearing a different face. She turned back to her bread dough, punching it down harder than necessary, reminding herself that this was a job. That Caleb's kindness was the kindness of a decent employer, nothing more. That she was here to cook and clean and be useful, and anything beyond that was fantasy better left unexplored. But the warmth in her chest wouldn't quite dissipate, no matter how sternly she lectured herself. That afternoon, Pete drove her into Dry Creek for supplies again. They needed flour and sugar, coffee and salt, and Maggie wanted to buy seeds for a kitchen garden if Caleb would allow it. The ride was pleasant, the weather warming into true spring, and Pete kept up his usual stream of comfortable chatter. "Boss is different lately," Pete said as they approached town. "Lighter, somehow. Still quiet, still works himself half to death, but there's less weight on him. You've been good for this place, Miss Maggie." "I just cook," Maggie said, uncomfortable with praise she wasn't sure she'd earned. "You do a hell of a lot more than that, ma'am, and you know it." Pete glanced at her. You made that house into a home again. That's not nothing. They were loading supplies at Duffy's when the trouble started. Maggie was inside, selecting seeds from the mercantile's limited selection when she heard raised voices outside. She moved to the window and felt her stomach drop. Viola Kane stood in the street, dressed in crimson silk, surrounded by half a dozen townspeople like a queen holding court, and she was pointing at Caleb's wagon. "That's the third time this month they've come to town," Viola was saying, her voice carrying. "The big girls already run through their supplies, eating them out of house and home. Caleb Rourke must be regretting his charity by now." "Maybe he likes having someone to cook for him," one of the women said uncertainly. "Cook for him?" Viola laughed, brittle and mean. "Honey, a man doesn't hire someone who looks like that for cooking. He hires her because he's desperate for any kind of female company, even if it's the sort you have to close your eyes around." Laughter rippled through the group, cruel and casual. Maggie's hands tightened on the packet of seeds she was holding. "I give it another month," Viola continued. "Maybe 2. Then Caleb will realize he's made a mistake and send her packing. Poor thing will have to find another lonely rancher desperate enough to pretend she's not taking up space." Duffy appeared at Maggie's elbow. "Don't listen to her," he said quietly. "She's just mean-spirited." "I know what she is," Maggie said. Her voice came out steady, but her heart was hammering. "The question is what I do about it." "You do nothing," Duffy said firmly. "You go back to that ranch, you do your work, and you let Viola Kane choke on her own poison. That's what wins in the long run." But Maggie was tired of letting cruelty slide past unchallenged. Tired of absorbing other people's nastiness like it was somehow her responsibility to make them feel better about their own ugliness. She paid for her purchases, walked outside, and stood on the mercantile steps where everyone could see her. "Mrs. Kane," she said clearly, and the street went quiet. Viola turned, eyebrows raised. "Oh, the help. How lovely to see you." "I heard what you said about me," Maggie continued, keeping her voice level. "About how I'm eating the ranch out of supplies, and how Mr. Rourke will send me away once he realizes his mistake." "Did you?" Viola's smile was sharp. "Well, honey, if you were listening, you know I speak truth. No shame in it. We all have to face reality eventually." "You're right," Maggie said. "We do have to face reality. So here's mine. I work hard, I earn my keep, and I make that ranch run smoother than it has in 2 years. The men are fed, the house is clean, and Mr. Rourke is satisfied with my work. That's reality." "How nice for you," Viola said, but there was an edge in her voice now. "And here's your reality," Maggie continued. "You stand in the street making cruel comments about people you don't know because it makes you feel powerful. But power built on cruelty isn't power at all. It's just fear dressed up in silk and spite. You're afraid that if you stop making others feel small, people might notice you're not as big as you pretend to be." The street had gone silent. Even Pete, who'd been loading the last sack of flour, had frozen mid-motion. Viola's face flushed dark. "You have no idea who you're talking to." "I know exactly who I'm talking to," Maggie said. "I've met a dozen Viola Kanes in a dozen different towns. The names change, but the song stays the same. And I'm done dancing to it." She picked up her supplies. "Pete, are we ready to go?" "Yes, ma'am," Pete said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been pride. They were climbing onto the wagon when Viola's voice rang out, shrill with fury. "You'll regret this. I promise you that. Nobody speaks to me that way and gets away with it." Maggie looked back at the woman in the crimson dress, at the townspeople standing around her with expressions ranging from shock to carefully hidden approval, and felt a strange calm settle over her. "Mrs. Kane," she said clearly, "I've spent my whole life regretting things I didn't do because I was too afraid of what people like you might say. I'm done with that. Say what you want. I'll be too busy working to listen." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Pete kept glancing at her like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the right words. Finally, as they turned onto the road that led to Caleb's property, he spoke. "That was the bravest damn thing I've seen in years," he said. "Begging your pardon for the language, ma'am, but it needed saying." "It was stupid," Maggie said, but her hands were shaking now that the moment had passed. "I just made an enemy who runs the only saloon in town. What was I thinking?" You were thinking you'd had enough, Pete said firmly. And you were right to say it. Viola Kane's been poisoning this town for too long. Someone needed to stand up to her. Caleb's going to hear about this, Maggie said. She'll make sure of it. Let him hear it, Pete said. Boss doesn't scare easy, and he sure as hell doesn't let people push around folks under his protection. You did good, Miss Maggie. Don't doubt that. But Maggie was doubting everything by the time they reached the ranch. She'd let her temper get the better of her, had spoken out in a way that would reflect on Caleb and his household, and now there would be consequences. Viola Kane wasn't the type to let challenges pass unanswered. She unloaded the supplies with Pete's help, then threw herself into preparing supper with the kind of fierce concentration that came from trying not to think. Roast beef, potatoes, carrots, fresh bread, apple pie made from the dried apples she'd found in the back of the pantry. Food as apology, as armor, as proof that she was worth the trouble she'd just caused. The men came in at their usual time, dusty and tired, and ate with their usual enthusiasm. But Maggie could barely taste her own food, too aware of the moment when Caleb would hear what had happened, when he'd realized that hiring her had brought town drama to his doorstep. After the men had gone, Maggie was washing dishes when Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway. His expression was unreadable, and her stomach dropped. Pete told me what happened in town, he said. Mr. Rourke, Caleb, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have confronted her. I couldn't stand there and listen anymore, and I know I should have been smarter about it, but Maggie, Caleb's voice cut through her spiral. Stop. She stopped, her hands dripping dishwater onto the floor. You stood up for yourself, Caleb said. That's nothing to apologize for. But Viola Kane will do what she always does, talk too much and accomplish nothing. Caleb moved into the kitchen, and Maggie found herself backed against the counter, not from fear but from the sheer presence of him. You think I'm worried about what that woman says? I stopped caring about town gossip 2 years ago when they decided I was dangerous just because I was grieving. Let her talk. It changes nothing. She said she'd make me regret it, Maggie said quietly. Then she'll have to go through me first. Caleb's jaw was set, his eyes hard. You work for me, Maggie. That means you're under my protection, and I don't let people hurt what's mine. What's mine? The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meanings Maggie didn't dare examine. I don't want to cause trouble for you, she said. You're not causing trouble. You're refusing to be a victim, and that's different. Caleb was quiet for a moment. My whole life, people have made assumptions about me based on how I look. Said I was dangerous or stupid or only good for heavy lifting. Alice saw past that. And when she died, I forgot that I could demand better. I let the town decide who I was, and I became that person, isolated, angry, half dead. He met Maggie's eyes. You reminded me today that we don't have to accept other people's stories about us, that we can write our own. I'm grateful for that. Maggie's throat tightened. I was just angry. Anger can be righteous, Caleb said, especially when it's been earned. Don't apologize for having a spine, Maggie. It's one of the things I respect most about you. He left then, and Maggie stood in her kitchen with soapy hands and a heart that felt too large for her chest, wondering when exactly she'd stopped being just the cook and started being something more complicated. The answer came 3 days later in the form of a storm that rolled in from the north like the end of the world. Maggie had seen storms on the prairie before, the sky turning green-black, the wind picking up until it screamed, the rain coming down in sheets that turned the ground to mud. But this was different. This was violence wearing weather as a mask. This was nature reminding everyone that survival on the frontier was never guaranteed. The storm hit just after supper. One moment the evening was clear, the next the sky had gone dark and the wind was howling like something alive and furious. Caleb appeared in his kitchen, his face grim. Get the windows closed and stay inside, he said. This one's going to be bad. What about you? Maggie asked, alarmed by the tension in his voice. The herd's in the north pasture. If this storm spooks them... He didn't finish the sentence, just grabbed his oilskin coat and headed for the door. Caleb, wait! Maggie followed him to the porch. It's too dangerous. It's more dangerous to let spooked cattle stampede, Caleb said. I'll have Pete and Ben with me. We know what we're doing. The first crack of lightning split the sky. illuminating the prairie in stark white relief. Thunder followed so close it rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, Maggie heard the sound she'd been dreading, the rumble of hooves, low and ominous. "They're running," Caleb said, and there was something in his voice Maggie had never heard before. Fear. "I'm coming with you," Maggie said. "Absolutely not. You'll need all the help you can get. You can stay here where it's safe." Caleb's hand closed around her arm, not hard, but firm. "I can't worry about the cattle and you at the same time. Please, Maggie, stay inside." He was gone before she could argue, running toward the barn where Pete and Ben were already saddling horses. Maggie stood on the porch watching as the three men rode into the storm, swallowed by darkness and rain, and felt terror settle into her bones like ice. Cattle stampedes killed people. She'd heard the stories, cowboys crushed under thousands of pounds of panicked beef, horses going down and taking their riders with them, men vanishing into the night and never coming back. And Caleb was out there, along with Pete and Ben, trying to turn a force of nature that couldn't be reasoned with. Maggie went back inside and closed the windows, but she couldn't make herself stay put. She paced the kitchen, watching lightning turn the world white and listening to thunder that sounded like the earth breaking apart. Somewhere out there, Caleb was risking his life for animals that could be replaced, and there was nothing she could do to help. Or was there? She grabbed 2 lanterns from the kitchen shelf, checking the oil levels and making sure the wicks were trimmed. Then she found the largest pot she owned and a wooden spoon. It was a crazy idea, probably useless, but it was better than standing inside while the men she'd come to care about faced death in the dark. Maggie ran out into the storm, gasping as rain hit her like thrown stones. The wind tried to tear the lanterns from her hands, but she held tight, making for the low rise east of the house where she'd have a clear view of the pastures. Her dress was soaked in seconds, plastered to her body, but she kept moving, climbing the rise with legs that burned and lungs that ached. From the top of the rise she could see them, lights moving in the distance, riders trying to turn the herd, and she could hear them too, the thunder of thousands of hooves getting closer, the sound of something massive and unstoppable bearing down on everything in its path. Maggie set the lanterns on the ground, spacing them apart so their light would be visible from a distance. Then she picked up the pot and wooden spoon and started making noise. She banged the spoon against the pot, swinging the makeshift bell in wide arcs, screaming into the wind with everything she had. It felt ridiculous, one woman with 2 lanterns and a pot trying to redirect a stampede. But she kept going, kept making noise, kept swinging the lights, because doing something, anything, was better than standing helpless while the men fought for their lives. Time lost meaning. There was only the storm, the lights, the pot, and the terrible sound of cattle getting closer. Maggie's arms burned, her throat went raw from screaming, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because somewhere out there in the darkness, Caleb was fighting to save his ranch, and she'd be damned if she'd let him die without knowing she'd tried everything to help. Then, gradually, the sound changed. The thunder of hooves shifted direction, veering away from the house, and Maggie realized with shock that it was working. The cattle were turning, guided by the lights and noise, giving the riders room to maneuver. She kept banging, kept screaming, until her voice gave out and her arms felt like lead. When the stampede finally passed, curving away toward the western pastures where the land was open and flat, Maggie sank to the ground, shaking with exhaustion and reaction. The storm was already breaking, the worst of the fury passing as quickly as it had come. Stars appeared through tattered clouds, and the rain slowed to a drizzle. She didn't know how long she sat there before she heard hoofbeats approaching. Then Caleb was there, sliding off his horse and dropping to his knees beside her, his hands on her shoulders. "Maggie, Maggie, look at me." She looked up and saw his face streaked with mud and rain, his eyes wild with something between fury and fear. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded. "You could have been killed if the herd had kept coming." "But they didn't," Maggie said. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. "They turned. Because of you." Caleb's grip on her shoulders tightened. "Because you stood on this rise with lanterns and made enough noise to give us time to turn them. You saved us. Could have lost men tonight. Could have lost me." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. I couldn't just stay inside, Maggie whispered. I had to do something. Caleb pulled her against his chest, his arms coming around her like walls against the world. He was solid and warm despite the rain, and Maggie could hear his heart hammering beneath her cheek. Don't ever do something that's stupid and brave again, he said roughly. You hear me? I can't lose. He stopped, and Maggie felt him shake his head. Just don't. They stayed like that for a long moment, two people who'd learned the hard way that life on the frontier was fragile and fierce and worth fighting for. Then Pete and Ben appeared, leading Caleb's horse, their faces splitting into grins when they saw Maggie. Miss Maggie, Pete said, you just became a legend. That was the craziest thing I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot of crazy. Couldn't have turned them without her, Ben added quietly. We'd have lost half the herd, maybe more. Caleb stood, pulling Maggie up with him. She swayed, her legs suddenly unsteady, and he caught her before she could fall. Get her inside, Pete said. She's freezing. Caleb lifted Maggie like she weighed nothing, which she definitely didn't, and carried her down the rise toward the house. She wanted to protest, to say she could walk, but exhaustion had her in its grip and the warmth of his arms felt too good to fight. He set her down in the kitchen and immediately began building up the fire in the stove. Then he grabbed blankets from the chest in the main room and wrapped them around her shoulders. You need to get out of those wet clothes, he said, his voice gruff. Get warm and dry before you catch your death. I will, Maggie said. But Caleb, are you all right? Are Pete and Ben? We're fine. Bruised, exhausted, but fine. Thanks to you. He crouched in front of her chair, his eyes level with hers. Maggie, what you did tonight was probably stupid, she interrupted. Was the bravest thing I've seen in years, Caleb finished. You didn't have to risk yourself for us, for the ranch. But you did anyway. Of course I did, Maggie said. This is my home now. You're my... She stopped, not sure what word belonged in that space. Employer felt too distant, friend too simple. I know, Caleb said softly, and the way he said it made Maggie wonder if he understood what she couldn't say. He stood and moved toward the door, then paused. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll see what damage the storm did. But tonight we're all alive because you refused to let us face it alone. After he left, Maggie sat wrapped in blankets by the warm stove, listening to the ranch settle into quiet. Her body ached, her voice was gone, but something in her chest felt light and fierce and whole. She'd stood between the storm and the people she cared about, and somehow, impossibly, it had been enough. Outside, the stars broke through completely, painting the prairie in silver light. And in the house on the rise above the floodplain, Margaret Turner understood that she'd become someone new, someone who didn't hide when danger came, someone who fought for the things that mattered, someone who belonged. Morning came too bright and too soon, sunlight streaming through Maggie's window like the storm had never happened. But her body remembered, muscles screaming protest when she tried to sit up, her throat raw when she swallowed, bruises blooming purple across her arms where she'd gripped the lanterns. She dressed slowly, wincing at every movement, and made her way downstairs to find the kitchen already warm, the stove fired and coffee brewing. Caleb stood at the window, looking out at the prairie. He turned when she entered, and Maggie saw the same exhaustion etched into his face that she felt in her bones. You should still be in bed, he said. So should you. Maggie moved to the stove, checking the coffee. The men will need breakfast. The men can wait. Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides and took her arm gently, guiding her to a chair. You nearly died last night. You're allowed to rest. I didn't nearly die, Maggie protested, but she sat anyway because her legs were grateful for it. I stood on a hill with lanterns. In the middle of a stampede. Caleb poured coffee and set the cup in front of her with a care that felt deliberate. Pete says if you'd been 50 yards closer, the lead cattle would have trampled you before they turned. Maggie wrapped her hands around the warm cup, watching steam rise. But I wasn't 50 yards closer, and they did turn. Because you're either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless, and I haven't decided which. Caleb sat across from her, his own coffee forgotten. What possessed you to run out there? I couldn't stay inside, Maggie said. I couldn't sit in this kitchen knowing you were out there risking your life while I did nothing. So I did what I could with what I had. But pots and lanterns against 1,000 head of cattle, Caleb said, and there was something in his voice, wonder, maybe, or disbelief, that anyone would be that foolish on his behalf. It worked, didn't it? This time. Caleb's jaw tightened. Next time? Next time I'll do the same thing, Maggie interrupted. Because this is my home, Caleb. This ranch, this kitchen, those men who eat my food and haul my water and leave robin's eggs on my windowsill. I'm not going to stand by while the people I care about face danger alone. The silence that followed was thick with things neither of them knew how to say. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice rough. You could have been killed, Maggie, and I would have... He stopped, shook his head. I can't lose someone else. Not like that. You won't, Maggie said softly. I'm tougher than I look. I know you are. Caleb met her eyes, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. That's what scares me. Before Maggie could respond, Pete and Ben clattered onto the porch, their voices carrying through the open window. Caleb stood, the moment breaking, and moved to let them in. Morning, boss, Pete said, then saw Maggie at the table. Miss Maggie, you should be resting after last night's heroics. Everyone keeps saying that, Maggie said, but breakfast won't make itself. The hell it won't, Pete said cheerfully. Ben and I can scramble some eggs and burn some bacon. You sit there and let us take care of you for once. I don't need... Yes, you do, Ben said quietly, already moving toward the pantry. You saved our lives last night, ma'am. Least we can do is feed you breakfast. Maggie watched in bemused silence as the two ranch hands took over her kitchen with enthusiastic incompetence, cracking eggs with more shell than yolk, making it to the bowl, and burning bacon to the consistency of charcoal. Caleb leaned against the doorframe watching them work, and when his eyes met Maggie's, she saw something that might have been amusement flickering behind his usual stoicism. The breakfast they produced was terrible. Rubbery eggs, cremated bacon, coffee so strong it could strip paint. But Maggie ate every bite because the men had made it with such genuine care that refusing would have been cruel. When they finally left to assess storm damage, Caleb lingered. They're right, you know, he said, about you needing rest. The ranch won't fall apart if you take one day to recover. I'll rest when the kitchen's clean, Maggie said, already standing to gather the dishes. Caleb caught her wrist gently. Maggie, please. The word coming from a man who rarely asked for anything stopped her. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, calloused, scarred, holding her like she was something precious that might break, and felt her resistance crumble. All right, she said, but only because you said please. She spent the afternoon on the porch with her mending, letting the sun warm away the chill that had settled into her bones during the storm. The prairie stretched out before her, vast and golden under cloudless sky, showing no signs of the violence that had torn through it just hours before. In the distance, she could see Pete and Ben riding the fence line, checking for damage, their figures small against the horizon. Caleb appeared mid-afternoon, leading a horse from the barn. He tied it at the porch rail and climbed the steps to where Maggie sat, surrounded by shirts and socks that needed patching. Come with me, he said. Where? Just come. He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Maggie took it, letting him pull her to her feet. Her muscles protested, but the ache was bearable now, dulled by rest and sunlight. Caleb helped her onto the horse, a gentle mare with kind eyes, then swung up behind her. Maggie stiffened at the sudden proximity, acutely aware of his chest against her back, his arms bracketing her as he gathered the reins. But Caleb clicked his tongue, and the horse moved forward, and there was nothing to do but lean into the solid warmth of him and try not to think about what it meant that her heart was racing. They rode in silence across the prairie, following the creek toward the northern boundary of the property. The land rose gradually, rolling hills covered in new grass that rippled like water in the breeze. Wildflowers dotted the landscape, purple lupine, yellow prairie roses, white yarrow, and the air smelled like growing things and possibility. After 20 minutes, Caleb guided the horse to a stop at the top of a rise. Before them, the prairie spread out in every direction, an ocean of grass meeting sky at a horizon so distant it seemed like the edge of the world. This is my favorite spot on the ranch, Caleb said, his voice low and close to her ear. Alice and I used to come up here on Sunday afternoons. We'd bring a blanket and just sit, watching the world be big and quiet. It's beautiful, Maggie said softly. I wanted you to see it. Caleb dismounted and reached up to help her down, his hands spanning her waist as he lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing. When her feet touched ground, he didn't immediately step back. I wanted you to see what you saved last night, not just the cattle or the ranch. This, all of this. Maggie looked out at the landscape, at the sheer scope of it, and felt something expand in her chest. I didn't think about saving the ranch, she admitted. I just thought about saving you. The words hung in the air between them, too honest, too revealing. Maggie wanted to take them back, to hide behind the safe distance of propriety and employer-employee boundaries, but it was too late. The truth was out. Maggie, Caleb said, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard before. Soft, almost tentative, like a man approaching something wild that might bolt. Why did you really come to Montana? The question caught her off guard. For the job, you know that. But why leave St. Louis? Why travel 300 miles for a position that might not even exist? Maggie was quiet for a long moment, watching clouds cast shadows across the prairie. Because I was tired, she finally said. Tired of being looked at like I was taking up space I hadn't earned. Tired of apologizing for existing. Tired of being told that someone like me should be grateful for scraps because that's all I deserved. She turned to face him. I thought if I went somewhere new, somewhere far enough away, maybe I could be different. Maybe I could be enough. You were always enough, Caleb said roughly. The problem wasn't you, it was everyone else being too damn blind to see it. You sound like you're speaking from experience. I am. Caleb looked out at the horizon, his profile stark against the sky. After Alice died, people started treating me different, like grief had made me dangerous, like sighs and sorrow added up to something violent. I stopped going to church because people would move away when I sat down, stopped going to town except when necessary because I was tired of the whispers. I built walls around myself and called it protection. What changed? Maggie asked. You. He turned back to her, and the directness of his gaze made her breath catch. You showed up refusing to apologize for taking up space. You stood in Viola Kane's face and didn't flinch. You ran into a stampede with nothing but pots and lanterns because you decided we were worth saving. You reminded me that the walls I built to keep hurt out were also keeping life out. Caleb, I'm not good with words, he continued. Never have been. Alice used to say I hoarded them like gold coins, only spending them when absolutely necessary. But I need you to understand something. He took a step closer, and Maggie found herself looking up at this man who'd become so much more than an employer. This ranch stopped being just a place to work the day you arrived. It became home again. The house breathes, the kitchen smells like bread. There's life here that I thought had died with Alice, and that's because of you. I just cook, Maggie whispered. You do so much more than that. Caleb's hand came up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands so large and scarred. You made me remember what it feels like to want to come inside at the end of the day, to look forward to morning coffee and evening meals, to care about something beyond the next fence that needs mending. Maggie's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm grateful you're here. I'm saying I don't want you to leave. I'm saying... He stopped, jaw working, clearly struggling with words that wanted to stay buried. I'm saying I care about you, Maggie Turner, more than an employer should care about his cook, more than is probably wise or proper, and I needed you to know that. The prairie wind whispered through the grass around them, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark sang. Maggie looked up at Caleb's face, weathered, scarred, honest, and saw her own truth reflected there, the truth she'd been too afraid to name, too conditioned by years of disappointment to believe in. I care about you too, she said softly. I tried not to. I told myself this was just a job, that I was here to work and nothing more. But somewhere between the biscuits and the storm, somewhere between your silence and your kindness, I stopped being able to pretend. Then don't pretend, Caleb said. I'm tired of pretending, Tired of holding myself back because I'm afraid of getting hurt again. Tired of living half a life because a full one seems too risky. What if we're making a mistake? Maggie asked. What if the town— Damn the town, Caleb said with sudden fierceness. Dry Creek has spent years telling us who we should be and how we should live. I'm done listening. You're here, I'm here, and whatever this is between us, it's ours, not theirs. Maggie felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't sad tears. They were the tears that came from holding something fragile and precious, and being terrified you'd drop it. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. No one's ever— Neither have I, Caleb said. Not since Alice, and I'm scared as hell, but I'd rather be scared with you than safe and alone. He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but Maggie didn't move. When his lips touched hers, gentle and questioning, she rose on her toes to meet him, her hands finding purchase on his shoulders. The kiss was brief, careful, weighted with the fear of two people who'd been hurt before and knew exactly how much courage it took to try again. When they pulled apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I won't rush you, he said quietly. We can take this as slow as you need. I just needed you to know that you matter, that you're seen, that someone in this world looks at you and sees exactly how extraordinary you are. Maggie's voice, when she finally found it, was thick with emotion. I spent my whole life being told I was too much, too big, too loud, too present. And here you are, telling me I'm extraordinary. You are, Caleb said simply. And anyone who couldn't see that was a fool. They stood on that rise for a long time, the prairie spreading out around them. Two people who'd learned the hard way that love, if that's what this was becoming, required the kind of courage most people never had to summon. The courage to be vulnerable after being wounded. The courage to hope after losing hope. The courage to take up space and demand to be seen when the world had spent years telling you to shrink. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Caleb said, We should head back. Pete and Ben will worry. They rode back in comfortable silence, Maggie leaning into Caleb's warmth as the mare picked her way carefully down the rise. When they reached the ranch, Pete and Ben were on the porch, and the knowing looks they exchanged when they saw how close Maggie and Caleb were sitting made her face heat. Everything all right on the fence line? Caleb asked, dismounting and then helping Maggie down. Few breaks, nothing we can't fix, Pete said, his grin entirely too knowing. Everything all right here? Fine, Caleb said shortly, but there was no heat in it. Good, Pete said, because Miss Maggie, you should know, we saw riders heading this way about 20 minutes ago, 6 or 7 of them coming from town. The warmth that had been building in Maggie's chest turned cold. Who? Couldn't tell from this distance, but one of them was wearing something red. Pete's expression sobered. Bright red, like Viola Kane's favorite dress, Maggie finished, her stomach dropping. She's coming here. Let her come, Caleb said, his voice gone hard. This is my property. She's got no business here unless I invite her. But 10 minutes later, when the riders crested the rise and came into view, Maggie saw it wasn't just Viola. It was half the town. The mayor, the sheriff, Viola in her crimson silk, and several other townspeople she recognized from her trips to Dry Creek. They rode in formation like a delegation, or maybe like a mob with delusions of legitimacy. Caleb, Maggie said quietly, fear curling in her stomach. What do they want? Nothing good, Caleb said. He stepped forward, putting himself between Maggie and the approaching riders, and she saw Pete and Ben move to flank him. Protection, solidarity, a line that said clearly, to get to her, you go through us first. The riders stopped 20 feet from the porch, and Viola Kane dismounted with theatrical grace. Caleb Rourke, she called out, her voice carrying false sweetness. So good to see you. We need to have a conversation. Then talk, Caleb said flatly. Viola smiled, and it was the smile of a cat who'd cornered something small. It's come to our attention that you've been harboring a woman of questionable character. Someone who's been causing trouble in town, making accusations, disrupting the peace. You mean Miss Turner, Caleb said. My cook, who lives and works on my property and has every right to speak her mind. About that, the mayor said, urging his horse forward. He was a portly man with a politician's smooth voice. "Mr. Rourke, we respect your right to hire whomever you choose, but when that person starts causing problems that affect the whole town—" "What problems?" Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. "Be specific." "She publicly insulted Mrs. Kane," the mayor said, "caused a scene in front of half the town. That kind of behavior was defending herself against cruelty," Caleb interrupted. "Or are we pretending Viola didn't stand in the street making vicious comments about Miss Turner's appearance and character?" "I was simply stating facts," Viola said, examining her nails. "If the truth hurts—" "The truth is you're a bully who enjoys making people feel small," Maggie said, stepping out from behind Caleb despite his arm reaching out to stop her. "And I'm tired of pretending that's acceptable behavior just because you own a saloon and wear expensive dresses." Viola's eyes narrowed. "You see, Mayor, this is exactly the kind of disrespect—" "Disrespect?" Maggie's voice rose. "You want to talk about disrespect? You've spent weeks making cruel comments about my weight, my appearance, my worth as a human being. You've gossiped about Mr. Rourke, speculated about his desperation, and treated both of us like we're beneath you. And when I finally stood up and said enough, suddenly I'm the problem?" "You're causing division in the community," the mayor said. "Mrs. Kane is a respected businesswoman." "Mrs. Kane is a bully," Maggie said flatly, "and you all know it. You've been letting her poison this town for years because she's rich and pretty, and you're too afraid to call her out." The sheriff, who'd been quiet until now, shifted in his saddle. "Miss Turner, no one's saying you don't have a right to defend yourself. But the way you did it, publicly, aggressively—" "The way I did it was the only way that works with people like her," Maggie said. "Quiet dignity gets you nowhere when someone's determined to tear you down." "This is getting us nowhere," Viola said. She turned to Caleb, her voice going soft and reasonable. "Caleb, we've known each other for years. I knew Alice, considered her a friend. She'd be horrified to see what's become of her home, with this woman taking her place." "Don't!" Caleb's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare speak Alice's name. You weren't her friend. You tolerated her because she was married to me, and you sure as hell don't get to use her memory to justify cruelty." "I'm just trying to help," Viola said, but her eyes were hard. "This woman is clearly using you. She saw a grieving widower with property and money, and she saved my life 3 nights ago," Caleb said, and his voice carried across the yard with such force that even Viola went silent. When a storm hit and our herd stampeded, Miss Turner ran into the dark with lanterns and made enough noise to help us turn them. She risked her life for this ranch, for me and my men. So before you start making accusations about her character, maybe ask yourself what you've ever risked for anyone besides yourself." The townspeople shifted uncomfortably. Pete stepped forward, his voice clear. "Boss is telling truth. Miss Maggie saved our lives. We'd have lost men if she hadn't acted." "And she's the best cook in 3 counties, Ben added quietly. "Feeds us real food, keeps the house running. Ranch hasn't worked this smooth since Mrs. Alice passed." "That's all very touching," Viola said, "but it doesn't change the fact that she publicly humiliated me in front of half the town. There need to be consequences for that kind of behavior." "What consequences?" Caleb asked, his voice gone dangerous. "What exactly are you proposing, Viola?" "I'm proposing that Miss Turner apologize," Viola said, "publicly, in the street where she made her accusations, and that she agrees to conduct herself with more decorum going forward." "Or what?" Maggie asked. Viola's smile was sharp. "Or I'll make sure every business in Dry Creek knows that you and Mr. Rourke are living in sin. Unmarried woman, unmarried man, alone in a house 8 miles from town. The scandal will spread faster than wildfire, and by the time it's done, neither of you will be able to show your faces in civilized company." The threat hung in the air like poison. Maggie felt her face burn, but she held Viola's gaze. "We're not living in sin. I work here. I have my own room. Everything is completely proper." "Is it?" Viola's eyebrows rose. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks mighty cozy, and people will believe what I tell them to believe." "That's slander," the sheriff said uncomfortably. "Mrs. Kane, I think Miss Turner has a choice," Viola interrupted. Apologize and behave, or face the consequences of her actions. It's really very simple. Maggie looked at Caleb, at the fury in his face, at Pete and Ben standing ready to fight for her. She thought about Alice Rourke's kitchen that had become hers, about the prairie that had started to feel like home, about the man who'd looked at her and seen past everything the world used to measure her. She thought about spending her whole life apologizing for existing, for taking up space, for daring to demand dignity. And she made her choice. No, Maggie said clearly. I won't apologize. Not for defending myself, not for speaking truth, not for refusing to accept cruelty as the price of existing in your town. You want to spread lies about me and Mr. Rourke? Go ahead. But you'll do it knowing that you're the one who chose malice over decency. Viola's face flushed dark. You'll regret this. Maybe, Maggie said, but I'll regret it standing up, not on my knees. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the sheriff cleared his throat. Mrs. Kane, I think we should go. This is private property, and Mr. Rourke's made it clear Miss Turner is welcome here. We've got no legal standing to force anything. The sheriff's right, the mayor said, looking uncomfortable. We should leave this between them. Viola looked around at the faces of the people she'd brought, seeing support crumbling, and her expression went cold. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. Both of you. You'll learn what happens when you cross me. She remounted her horse with less grace than she'd dismounted, jerked the reins, and rode off without waiting for the others. The townspeople followed more slowly, several of them looking back with expressions that might have been respect or might have been pity. When the last rider disappeared over the rise, Maggie felt her legs start to shake. Caleb caught her before she could fall, his arms coming around her with the same care he'd shown after the stampede. That was brave, he said quietly, and probably stupid, but mostly brave. She's going to destroy us, Maggie whispered. You know she will. She'll spread rumors, turn the town against us. Let her try, Caleb said. I've survived worse than Viola Kane's gossip. So have you. And if the price of keeping you here, of building whatever this is between us, if the price is town approval, then I'll pay it gladly. But your reputation? My reputation's been in tatters for 2 years, Caleb said. I stopped caring what Dry Creek thought about me the day they decided grief made me dangerous. You're worth more than their good opinion, Maggie. You're worth everything. Maggie buried her face in his chest and let the tears come. Fear tears, relief tears, tears for the fight she'd just chosen and all the fight still ahead. But beneath the fear was something else, something fierce and bright and unbreakable. She'd stood her ground. She'd refused to apologize for existing. And the man holding her had stood beside her, had chosen her even knowing what it would cost. Maybe, Maggie thought as the sun set over the prairie and painted everything gold, maybe that was enough. Maybe two people choosing each other despite what the world said was all the foundation they needed to build something lasting. Maybe love, if that's what this was really just the courage to be seen and the strength to keep standing when others demanded you kneel. And if that was true, then she and Caleb had already won, regardless of what Viola Kane did next. The rumors started before dawn. Pete heard them first when he rode into Dry Creek for nails 2 days after Viola's visit. Whispers behind hands, conversations that stopped when he approached, eyes that slid away from direct contact. By the time he returned to the ranch, his jaw was tight and his knuckles were white on the reins. It's bad, he told Caleb and Maggie in the kitchen, his hat crushed between his hands. Viola's been busy. She's telling anyone who'll listen that you two are living in sin, that Miss Maggie seduced you for your property, that the whole setup is improper and scandalous. The church ladies are in an uproar, and some of the men are saying things I won't repeat in front of Miss Maggie. Maggie felt her stomach drop, but Caleb's expression didn't change. Let them talk, he said flatly. Boss, it's worse than talk. Duffy says some folks are organizing, wanting to ride out here again. They're calling it a moral intervention, whatever the hell that means. Pete looked miserable. I'm sorry. I know you said to let it go, but I thought you should know what's coming. Thank you for the warning, Caleb said. He looked at Maggie, and she saw something fierce and protective flash in his eyes. We need to talk. After Pete left, Caleb guided Maggie to the table and sat across from her, his hands folded like he was about to deliver difficult news. "There's a way to stop this," he said quietly. "One way that cuts off every rumor Viola can spread, every accusation she can make." Maggie's heart started hammering. "What way?" "We get married." The words came out simple and direct. No preamble, no romance. "We ride into Dry Creek tomorrow, find the preacher, and make it legal. Then there's no scandal, no impropriety, nothing for them to use against us." Maggie stared at him, her mind reeling. "Caleb, you can't. That's not. We've known each other less than 2 months." "I know." His jaw was set, his eyes steady. "But I also know that you're the first person since Alice who's made me want to live instead of just survive. I know you're brave and strong, and you make this house feel like home. I know I'd rather have you here as my wife than lose you because some vindictive woman wants to destroy what we're building." "That's not a reason to get married," Maggie said, her voice shaking. "That's running from a problem, not solving it." "Is it?" Caleb leaned forward, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like claiming what I want before someone else can take it away. Maggie, I care about you, more than care if I'm being honest. And if marriage is what it takes to keep you here, to keep building this life we've started, then that's what I want." "But what if you regret it?" Maggie whispered. "What if you wake up in a year and realize you made a mistake, that you married someone you barely know just to stop gossip?" "I won't regret it." Caleb reached across the table and took her hands in his, rough palms against her flour-dusted fingers. "Alice taught me something before she died. She said life's too short to wait for perfect timing, that sometimes you have to grab what matters and hold on tight. I lost her because I couldn't control fate. But I can control this. I can choose you, Maggie. I am choosing you. The question is whether you'll choose me back." Maggie looked down at their joined hands, at the visual representation of everything she'd never let herself hope for. A man who saw her, who wanted her, who was willing to stand against an entire town for the right to keep her. She thought about Alice Rourke's kitchen that had become hers, about mornings spent making bread while Caleb drank coffee in comfortable silence, about the way he'd held her after the stampede like she was something precious, worth protecting. She thought about spending her whole life waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect man, the perfect circumstances that would somehow make her worthy of love. And she realized that perfection was a cage, and she was tired of living behind bars. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across Caleb's face was like sunrise after a long night, slow, warm, transforming everything it touched. He stood and pulled her up with him, his arms coming around her in an embrace that felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure all at once. "Tomorrow, then," he said against her hair, "we ride into Dry Creek and we do this right. Let Viola Kane and everyone else see that we're not hiding, we're not ashamed, and we're not going anywhere." That night, Maggie lay in her bed staring at the ceiling and trying to process the fact that tomorrow she'd be married. Married. To a man she'd known for 6 weeks, in a ceremony that was as much defiance as it was commitment. She should have been terrified, should have been questioning everything, but instead she felt a strange calm settling over her like a blanket. This was right. Maybe not conventional, maybe not the fairy tale she'd read about in books, but right in the way bone-deep certainty was right. Caleb had seen her at her worst and her best, had watched her stand up to bullies and run into stampedes, and he'd chosen her anyway. Not despite who she was, but because of it. That was worth more than 1,000 perfect proposals, more than years of courtship, more than any promise wrapped in pretty words. The next morning, Maggie dressed in her best dress, deep blue wool that she'd carefully mended and pressed, and braided her hair with hands that shook only slightly. When she came downstairs, she found Caleb waiting in the kitchen, clean-shaven and wearing a black suit she'd never seen before. He looked uncomfortable in the formal clothes, but when he saw her, his expression softened. "You look beautiful," he said. "I look nervous," Maggie corrected, but she smiled. "You clean up nice yourself." Pete and Ben appeared on the porch, both dressed in their Sunday best. "We're coming with you," Pete announced. "You're going to need witnesses, and we're not letting you face the town alone." "You don't have to," Maggie started. "Yes, we do," Ben said quietly. You're family now. We protect family. The ride into Dry Creek was surreal, like traveling through a dream where everything looked familiar but felt strange. Maggie sat on the wagon seat between Caleb and Pete, her hands folded in her lap, watching the prairie roll past and trying to imagine what would happen when they reached town. Would people throw things, shout, or would they just stare with the particular cruelty of silent judgment? They reached Dry Creek just before noon, when the sun was high and hot, and the streets were busy with midweek commerce. Heads turned as Caleb's wagon rolled down the main street. Conversations stopped. People emerged from buildings to watch, drawn by the unusual sight of the ranch crew in their finest clothes, heading toward the church at the end of town. Viola Kane stepped out of the saloon, took one look at the wagon, and her face went white with fury. She started toward them, but the sheriff appeared from his office and stepped into her path, saying something Maggie couldn't hear, but that made Viola stop in her tracks. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the small white church, helped Maggie down, and offered her his arm. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "No," Maggie admitted. "But let's do it anyway." They walked up the church steps together, Pete and Ben flanking them like honor guards, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the church was cool and dim, smelling of candle wax and old wood. Reverend Matthews was at the altar arranging hymn books, and he looked up in surprise when they entered. "Mr. Rourke," he said, setting down the books. "This is unexpected." "Reverend," Caleb said, "Miss Turner and I would like to be married, today, if possible." The Reverend's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Today? But there are procedures, banns to be read." "We don't have time for procedures," Caleb said firmly. "We have witnesses, we're both of age and sound mind, and we're asking you to marry us. Will you do it or not?" Reverend Matthews looked between them, taking in Caleb's set jaw and Maggie's nervous determination, and something in his expression softened. "Does this have anything to do with the rumors Mrs. Kane's been spreading?" "It has everything to do with those rumors," Caleb said, "and with putting an end to them permanently." "I see." The Reverend was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. But I won't have it said that I married you just to stop gossip. Mr. Rourke, do you want to marry this woman? Not because you feel obligated, not because the town is talking, but because you genuinely wish to make her your wife." "I do," Caleb said without hesitation. "Miss Turner?" The Reverend turned to her. "Do you want to marry this man? Are you entering this marriage of your own free will?" Maggie looked at Caleb, at his scarred hands and weathered face, at the quiet strength in his eyes, at the man who'd given her a home when no one else would. "Yes," she said clearly, "I want to marry him." "Then let's begin," Reverend Matthews said. He gestured for them to stand before the altar, and Pete and Ben moved to flank them as witnesses. The ceremony was brief. The words familiar from 1,000 weddings Maggie had never imagined would apply to her. She spoke her vows in a voice that grew steadier with each word, promising to love and honor and stand beside this man through whatever came. Caleb's voice when he made his vows was rough with emotion, his hand steady when he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. A ring that had belonged to his mother, he'd told her quietly, saved all these years for a purpose he'd never been sure would come. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed her with a gentleness that made tears prick Maggie's eyes. Not the kiss of desperate passion, but something deeper, the kiss of commitment, of choice, of two people standing together against the world. "Congratulations," the Reverend said warmly. "May God bless your union." He paused, then added, "And for what it's worth, I think you're both very brave." They signed the marriage certificate with Pete and Ben as witnesses, and then they walked back out into the Montana sunshine as Mr. and Mrs. Caleb Rourke. The street had filled with people while they were inside, drawn by curiosity and gossip like moths to flame. Maggie felt her steps falter when she saw the crowd, but Caleb's hand tightened on hers. "Head up," he murmured. "We've got nothing to be ashamed of." They walked down the church steps together, and Maggie felt every eye on them, felt the weight of judgment and speculation. Then Duffy pushed through the crowd, his face split by a genuine smile. "Congratulations," he called out, and his voice carried in the sudden quiet. "That's wonderful news." Thank you, Caleb said, and there was warning in his voice, a challenge to anyone who wanted to disagree. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Then the sheriff stepped forward, removing his hat. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Rourke, he said formally. I wish you both much happiness. It was like a dam breaking. Other people stepped forward. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. The dry goods store owner and his wife. The blacksmith. A few ranch families who knew Caleb and respected his work. They offered congratulations and well wishes, and if their smiles were uncertain and their eyes kept darting to the watching crowd, at least they were trying. Viola Kane stood on the saloon steps, her face twisted with fury. This is ridiculous, she called out. They barely know each other. This is clearly a sham marriage to cover up impropriety. That's enough, Viola. The sheriff's voice was sharp. They're married in the eyes of God and the law. What you think about their timeline is your business, but you'll keep it to yourself or I'll charge you with slander. Slander? Viola's voice went shrill. For speaking truth? For spreading malicious rumors without evidence, the sheriff said firmly. He turned to Caleb and Maggie. I apologize for the trouble you've had. You're both good people, and you deserve better than what this town's given you. Thank you, Sheriff, Caleb said. Then he raised his voice so it carried across the street. Miss Turner, Mrs. Rourke now, came to Montana looking for honest work. I gave her that work because she's skilled and hard-working and deserved a chance. Over the past weeks, she's proven herself 100 times over. She saved my ranch during that storm, saved my men's lives, and made my house into a home again. I chose to marry her because I respect her, I care for her, and I want her in my life. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. The challenge hung in the air. Several people shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Even Viola seemed to realize she'd lost this battle because she turned on her heel and stalked back into the saloon, slamming the door behind her. Let's go home, Maggie said quietly, and the word, home, felt like magic on her tongue. They climbed back into the wagon, Pete and Ben grinning like fools, and headed back toward the ranch. As Dry Creek disappeared behind them, Maggie felt something loosen in her chest. They'd done it. They'd stood in front of the town and claimed their right to happiness, and while not everyone had approved, enough people had shown kindness to matter. You all right? Caleb asked as the prairie opened up before them. I'm married, Maggie said, testing the word. I'm someone's wife. I never let myself believe it, Caleb said. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles just above the gold band. You're mine now, and I'm yours, and nothing Viola Kane or anyone else says can change that. That evening, after Pete and Ben had returned to the bunkhouse with promises to give the newlyweds some privacy, Maggie stood in the kitchen that had become hers and tried to process the enormity of what had happened. She was married. She lived here now, not as an employee, but as the lady of the house, as Caleb's wife, as someone with permanent claim to this place she'd come to love. Caleb appeared in the doorway, having changed out of his suit into his usual work clothes. I know this isn't how most marriages start, he said. No courtship, no proper proposal, no wedding celebration. Just a rushed ceremony to stop gossip. It's perfect, Maggie said, and meant it. Everything I never knew I needed. Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. I want you to know something, he said against her hair. This might have started as a solution to a problem, but that's not what it is anymore. You're not here out of convenience or necessity. You're here because I want you here, because I... He stopped, and Maggie felt him gather courage. Because I love you, Maggie Rourke. I didn't plan to, didn't expect to, but somewhere between your biscuits and your bravery, I fell in love with you. Maggie's breath caught. You love me? Is that so hard to believe? Caleb pulled back to look at her, his hands cupping her face. You're extraordinary. You're brave and strong and stubborn and kind. You make me want to be better, do better, live better. How could I not love you? I love you too, Maggie whispered, and saying the words out loud felt like opening a door she'd kept locked her entire life. I tried not to, told myself it was too fast, too risky, that I'd just get hurt like always. But you made it impossible not to love you. The kiss that followed was different from the one in the church, deeper, more urgent, weighted with promise and possibility. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "Come to bed," he said softly. "Not because we have to, but because I want to hold you and wake up tomorrow knowing this wasn't a dream." They climbed the stairs together, and Maggie found that Caleb had moved her things to the main bedroom, the room he'd shared with Alice, now transformed with fresh linens and the small touches that marked it as theirs instead of his and hers. The robin's egg Ben had given her sat on the dresser. Her hairbrush lay beside Caleb's shaving kit. The curtains were drawn back to show stars scattered across the prairie sky like diamonds on velvet. That night they lay together in the darkness, Caleb's arms around her and her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat and the wind whispering through the grass outside. They talked in quiet voices about the future they'd build, the garden Maggie wanted to plant, the repairs the house needed, the possibility of children if God granted them, the dreams they'd both stopped letting themselves have. "Thank you," Maggie said finally, when exhaustion was pulling her towards sleep. "For what?" "For seeing me. For choosing me. For giving me a place where I don't have to apologize for existing." She pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. "For teaching me that I was always enough." "You taught me that too," Caleb said. "We saved each other, I think. Made each other brave enough to try again." In the days that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Maggie still rose before dawn to make breakfast, still filled the kitchen with the smell of bread and coffee, but now Caleb stayed longer at the table, stealing kisses between bites of biscuit, and the house rang with laughter that had been absent for too long. Pete and Ben teased them mercilessly but gently, clearly delighted that their boss had found happiness again. 2 weeks after the wedding, Caleb came in from the barn carrying a large wooden crate. "Got something for you," he said, setting it on the kitchen table. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and approached cautiously. "What is it?" "Open it and see." Inside the crate, nestled in straw, was the most beautiful Dutch oven Maggie had ever seen. Cast iron, perfectly seasoned, large enough to make stew for a dozen people. She lifted it out with reverent hands, feeling the weight of it, the quality of the metal. "Caleb, this must have cost—" "Don't worry about the cost," he interrupted. "I wanted you to have it. Saw it in the catalog and thought of you. Thought about all the meals you'd make in it, all the ways you'd use it to take care of us." He moved closer, his hand coming to rest on her waist. "Besides, I figured every woman should get a wedding present from her husband, even if the wedding came a bit backwards." Maggie set the Dutch oven down and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. "It's perfect. You're perfect. This whole life is perfect." "Not perfect," Caleb said, but he was smiling. "Just real. Just ours." That evening, Maggie used her new Dutch oven to make a feast. Roasted chicken with herbs, potatoes, carrots, fresh bread, and a pie made from wild berries Pete had gathered. They ate together, the four of them, in the kitchen that had become the heart of the house. And if Pete made inappropriate jokes about newlyweds and Ben blushed so hard his ears turned red, well, that was just part of belonging to the strange, wonderful family they'd built. After dinner, Caleb suggested they walk up to the rise where he'd first told Maggie he cared for her. They went hand in hand through the cooling evening, the prairie settling into twilight around them. When they reached the top, they stood looking out at land that stretched forever in every direction. Their land now, their home, their future. "Do you ever regret it?" Maggie asked quietly. "Marrying me so quickly? Taking on all the complications that came with me?" "Never," Caleb said without hesitation. "Marrying you was the first completely right thing I've done since Alice died. Maybe the first brave thing, too." "I was so scared when I got off that stage in Dry Creek," Maggie admitted. "Scared that I'd traveled all this way for nothing, that I'd never find a place where I fit. And then there you were, this giant quiet man who looked at me and somehow saw past everything everyone else used to dismiss me." "I saw someone brave," Caleb said. "Someone who'd traveled 300 miles alone because she refused to accept the story other people were telling about her worth. Someone who deserved better than what she'd been given." He pulled her close, tucking her against his side. "I'm grateful every day that you got off that stage, Maggie. Grateful that you gave me a chance. Grateful that you were brave enough to build this with me." As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Maggie leaned into her husband's warmth and let herself feel the full weight of everything they'd overcome to get here. The cruelty and the gossip, the stampede and the storm, the fear and the courage, all of it had led to this moment. Two people who'd been told they were too much or not enough, standing together on a rise above the prairie, claiming their right to happiness. The seasons turned and the ranch prospered under their joint care. Maggie's garden grew lush and green, providing vegetables for the table and herbs for cooking. The house gleamed with attention, every room restored to life and purpose. And most importantly, it filled with warmth and laughter, and the particular kind of love that came from choosing each other daily, consciously, despite what the world said. Viola Kane's influence waned gradually as the town realized that the Rourkes weren't going anywhere, weren't ashamed, and weren't interested in seeking approval. Some people remained hostile, but others, more than Maggie had expected, extended tentative friendship, drawn by the obvious happiness radiating from the ranch on the rise. 6 months after their wedding, as Maggie stood at the window washing dishes and watching autumn paint the prairie in shades of amber and rust, she felt Caleb's arms come around her from behind, his hands settling on her still flat stomach with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Pete thinks you're expecting," he said quietly. "Says you've been looking tired in the mornings, drinking less coffee." "Pete should mind his own business," Maggie said, but she couldn't keep the smile from her voice. "But yes, the doctor in Billings confirmed it last week when I went with Ben to buy supplies." Caleb turned her in his arms, his face splitting into a smile so wide and genuine it transformed him. "A baby. We're having a baby." "Are you happy?" Maggie asked, suddenly uncertain. "I know this is fast, and we're still learning each other, and—" "I'm terrified," Caleb admitted. "I lost Alice and the baby. I'm scared to hope, scared to believe it'll work out this time. But I'm also happier than I've been in years. You've given me so much, Maggie. A home, a future, and now this." "We'll be all right," Maggie said, pressing her palm to his cheek. "We've survived everything else. We'll survive this too." And they did. The following spring, when the prairie was green and wild with new growth, Margaret Rourke gave birth to a healthy daughter with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. They named her Alice Rose, Alice for the woman whose memory had brought them together, Rose for the prairie flowers that grew wild and tough in soil that tried to break them. Standing on the porch with his wife and daughter in the golden afternoon light, Caleb Rourke looked out at the land he'd almost lost and felt gratitude settle into his bones. For the storm that had brought Maggie to his door, for her courage in staying when others would have run, for the life they'd built from the ruins of what came before. Maggie leaned against him, their daughter sleeping in her arms, and thought about the girl who'd stepped off the stage in Dry Creek less than 2 years ago, frightened, defensive, convinced she'd never be enough for anyone. That girl had become a woman who'd saved lives in a stampede, who'd stood up to a bully without flinching, who'd married a man she barely knew and turned that leap of faith into the foundation of an unshakable love. She'd learned that strength came in many forms, that courage was choosing to be seen when hiding felt safer, and that sometimes the best things in life happened when you stopped apologizing for taking up space and started claiming the space you deserved. In the years that followed, the Rourke Ranch became known throughout Montana Territory for many things: fine cattle, honest dealings, and the best food in 3 counties. But more than that, it became known as a place where people who'd been told they didn't fit could find acceptance, where those who'd been judged by inches and pounds instead of character could discover their worth, where love was measured not in conventional romance but in shared work, mutual respect, and the daily choice to stand together against whatever storms came. The house that had been silent with grief became loud with life, children's laughter, dinner conversation, the comfortable sounds of people who belonged. The kitchen where Maggie had first proven herself became the beating heart of not just a ranch, but a community, where neighbors gathered and friendships formed and anyone who came hungry left fed. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep and the prairie stretched out beneath a sky full of stars, Caleb and Maggie would stand on the porch together, 2 people who'd been measured by the world and found wanting, who'd chosen to measure each other by different standards, and found everything they'd been searching for. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Maggie asked one such evening, her hand in Caleb's. When I was desperate and you were grieving and neither of us knew what we were doing? Every day, Caleb said. He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. Best decision I ever made, hiring the woman who was too fat to love. I was never too fat to love, Maggie said, a smile playing at her lips. The world was just too small to see me properly. Good thing I wasn't looking at you the way the world did, Caleb said. Good thing I saw what mattered. What mattered was this: two broken people who'd refused to stay broken, who'd built something beautiful from pain and courage and stubborn hope. A marriage that started as defiance and became devotion. A home that rose from the ashes of grief and became a haven. A love story that didn't fit any conventional mold but was perfect in its imperfection. As the stars wheeled overhead and the wind whispered through the grass, Margaret and Caleb Rourke stood together in the life they'd fought for, claimed, and defended. They'd learned that happy endings weren't given. They were built, day by day, choice by choice, with calloused hands and brave hearts, and the absolute refusal to let others define their worth. They'd learned that sometimes the best love stories were the ones that started with a woman brave enough to demand respect and a man wise enough to give it. That home wasn't a place, but a feeling of being seen, valued, and chosen. That the strongest foundations weren't built on beauty or convention, but on biscuits, bravery, and the kind of stubborn loyalty that stopped stampedes and silenced mobs. And they'd learned, most importantly, that they were enough. Separately and together, they were always, gloriously, defiantly enough. The story that had begun with rejection and judgment ended here, complete and whole, on a Montana ranch, where the prairie stretched forever, and two people who'd been told they'd never belong had built a kingdom from dirt and determination and love that refused to apologize for existing. Here, in this hard land that had chosen to keep them both, Margaret and Caleb Rourke lived the rest of their days in happiness earned through courage, held together by choice, and sweetened by the simple truth that sometimes the best things in life come wrapped in packages the world overlooks. And that, in the end, was enough. More than enough. It was everything.